Hey, good morning, everybody, and welcome to Becoming a Bible Nerd. We are on chapter 3 of Esther this morning. So while people are getting on, we are going to talk a little bit about the holiday or the festival of Purim, which is coming up next week. Purim is from the Persian word pur, which means lot, and that is they're talking about the lots that were cast for the annihilation of the Jews. And since God redeemed them and saved them from this massacre, they celebrate every year to this very day the Feast of Purim. This is done by a lot of fun things that we're going to talk about. But before we do, I was just thinking this morning, good morning, everybody. What if we annually celebrated something big God did in our lives? Not only would we be remembering to be thankful over and over again and wouldn't be like spoiled little brats always wanting more, but we would be able to share that moment of our faith with our children and let it be passed down. So if you want to join me, let's just think of something big God's done in our lives and write that down on the calendar. Maybe each time, the same time each year, remember what God has done, talk about it with our kids and celebrate it. So this festival that is coming up, actually February 28th, the evening of February 28th, through March 1st is going to be when they all celebrate it. And they celebrate it by getting together and eating. And the kids are going to dress up like their favorite characters, usually Esther and Mordecai. The book of Esther will be read in an assembly, and this is hilarious. Every time they come to the word Haman, everyone boos and hisses. In my church for VBS, we always have the villain of the whatever story in the Bible that we picked out, and the villain always comes to the main assembly at the end, and the entire group of kids boo like crazy. And I have one daughter that's right there with them because my husband is usually the villain, and the other one's almost crying because everyone's booing her dad. But that's what it made me think of. The next thing they do is they make sweets together, and then they collect 2 different kinds and give them to someone special in their life. And then on the following day, it starts one evening, the following day, they go out and bless 2 people by buying them food or giving them money, 2 underprivileged people. So they're reaching out to the poor. And I think that this just sounds like a fun way to celebrate such an amazing gift that God did. So we're going to dig into the story today. We're going to talk about the pur that was cast, and we're going to do a lot of history. And for the first time in Bible Nerd history, we are going to be flipping through scripture like crazy. So just bear with me this morning. I'm going to try to make this as simple to understand as I can, but we have to understand a lot of background to understand this animosity between Haman and Mordecai. So let's get started. Chapter 3 of the book of Esther, Haman's plot to kill the Jews. It starts off by saying, after all this took place, talking about Esther becoming queen, King Ahasuerus honored Haman, son of Ammedatha the Agagite. He promoted him in rank and gave him a higher position than all other ranking officials. And so basically, about 4 years after Esther becomes queen, this Agagite is promoted to what we would understand as a prime minister of Persia. And so we have to stop here this morning and look at this Agagite. Agagites were descendants from King Agag, the leader, the king of the Amalekites. These were a nomadic desert people that had lived to be a thorn in the Hebrew people's side since the beginning of days. And so we are going to start off at the beginning of this story of the Agagites. And this is going to be found in Genesis 25:23. You can just write these references down if you want to go back and review them. You don't have to try to flip with me this morning because we're going to go fast. Now, this is talking about the birth of Jacob and Esau. We remember Abraham is the father of our faith. He has his son Isaac that he had in his old age, and then God tells him to sacrifice him on Mount Moriah, and then at the last minute, God provides a ram. So Isaac now is going to have his first 2 kids, and they're going to be twins. And the Lord tells Yes, I'm sorry. The Lord tells Rebecca, I just wanted to make sure, that 2 nations are going to be in her womb. 2 people will come from you and be separated. 1 people will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger. Esau was born first. Jacob ends up tricking him by the leading of his mother to take the blessing and the birthright from Esau. So Jacob ends up being renamed later on Israel, and that's where Jesus's line of people are going to come from, or Jesus will come from that line of people. Esau ends up becoming bitter and going into the desert and becoming a group of people that will always live to harass the Israelites. And so it starts with Esau and Jacob. In Genesis 36:12, I'm going to flip on over there. I thought this was going to be easier because I put bookmarks. Okay, in Genesis 36:12, we learn in Esau's family tree that Timnah, a concubine of Esau's son Eliphaz, bore Amalek to Eliphaz. So Esau's grandson is going to be Amalek. So this is where this line starts. So Esau has a grandson named Amalek, and he is going to raise up a people and do wicked things. And so Exodus 17, verses 8 through 14, we come to a famous battle between the Israelites and the Amalekites. The Amalekites are led by Amalek. So in this fight, the Amalekites had been doing some terrible things that we'll get to the Israelites. And so the Lord tells Moses to go to war with them. So Moses tells Joshua, I want you to go out and fight them, and me and, let me get to the right place. But basically, Moses and Aaron and Hur are going to go up on the mountaintop. And when Moses raised his staff in his arms, the Israelites are going to prevail, but he finds if he puts his arms down, the Amalekites prevail. So during this entire battle, Moses is having to have his hands up, and he gets so weary. So Aaron and Hur go and set a rock underneath him, and they set him down, and they end up holding his arms up during this battle. And when the battle was over, in verse 13 it says, so Joshua, he was the leader of the army, defeated Amalek and his army with the sword. In verse 14, the Lord said to Moses, this is important, write this down on a scroll as a reminder and recite it to Joshua. I will completely blot out the memory of Amalek under heaven. That seems so harsh, but God does not take lightly when people come against his plan for humanity. And if the Israelites would have been wiped out, there would have been no Messiah. So this is a huge, huge thing. So we're going to flip now to Numbers 24. And we're going to read 24:20. Now, during these battles, the Moabites kind of teamed up with the Amalekites. And the Moabites are angry with Israel, and they are going to go to a pagan divination expert, a wicked man that used astrology and magic to predict things. And they go to him, his name is Balaam, and they're going to pay him to pronounce curses on the Israelites. But through a crazy turn of events, God speaks to him and tells him to give these blessings over Israel. And this is part of one of his oracles. It says, Balaam, he's the divination expert, saw Amalek and proclaimed his poem. Amalek was the first among the nations, but his future is destruction. So we see prophecy talking about Amalek and destruction. So then we're almost done here, and we'll get to the story, but we turn to Deuteronomy 25:17, and in the book of Moses, in the book of the law, Moses is reminding the people of how awful the Amalekites are. And so in verse 17 of chapter 25, he says, remember what the Amalekites did to you, and this is where we find out one of the wicked things that they had done. Remember what they did to you on the journey after you left Egypt. They met you along the way and attacked all the stragglers from behind when you were tired and weary. The people at the end of the line, when those millions of people crossed the Red Sea and were coming through the desert into the promised land, were the elderly and the children. And the Amalekites came from behind and slaughtered the women and the children of the Israelites. So to go on, it says, they met you along the way and attacked your stragglers. When the Lord your God gives you rest from all your enemies in the around you in the land the Lord God is giving you to possess as an inheritance, blot out the memory of Amalek under heaven. Do not forget. So again, we see that God does not take lightly when people come across his people and his plan for redeeming the whole human race. This is serious business to him. He wants to blot out their memory and for the Israelites to not forget it. Lastly, this is important. We're coming to 1 Samuel. So the Israelites originally were supposed to have God to be their king, but they ended up wanting to look like the other nations around them, and they asked God for a king, and they chose for themselves King Saul. He was a Benjamite. So King Saul, this is going to be important to our story in verse 15. Samuel was a prophet that anointed Saul king, and then later he's going to anoint David king. So Samuel, the prophet, told Saul, this is what the Lord of hosts says. I witnessed what the Amalekites did to the Israelites when they opposed them along the way when they were coming out of Egypt. Remember, we just remembered that. Now go and attack the Amalekites and completely destroy everything they have. Do not spare them. Kill men and women and children and infants and oxen and sheep and camels and donkeys. When we read this without knowing the history of everything, it seems extremely cruel, like there's no grace there. But God knows if we do not wipe these people from the face of the earth, they are going to, for the rest of humanity, try to attack God's people and his plan for the coming Messiah. And then they are going to end up trying to attack God's people well after the Messiah. So he's saying we must destroy every single one of them. It sounds cruel, but even the children, even their animals, because they will stop at nothing to win against the Israelites. So then in verse 7 it says, Saul struck down the Amalekites from Havilah all the way to Shur, which is next to Egypt. He captured Agag, king of Amalek, alive, but he completely destroyed the rest of the people with the sword. Saul and the troops spared Agag and the best of the sheep, cattle, and choice animals, as well as the young rams and the best of everything else. They were not willing to destroy them, but they did destroy all the worthless and unwanted things. What did God say? To destroy everything. Saul does not obey. Then the word of the Lord came to Samuel. I regret that I made Saul king, for he has turned away from following me and has not carried out my instructions. In verse 13, Saul said, may the Lord bless you. He goes to Samuel and he says, may the Lord bless you. I've carried out the Lord's instructions. And Samuel replied, then what is the sound of the sheep and cattle I hear? And Saul answered, the troops brought them from the Amalekites and spared the best sheep and cattle in order to sacrifice them to the Lord. But we have destroyed the rest. So then he turns it into, we wanted to offer a sacrifice to the Lord, but that is not what the Lord asked him to do. So what good is a sacrifice to God if we didn't obey him in the process? So in 19 he says, so why didn't you obey the Lord? Why didn't you obey the Lord? Why did you rush on the plunder and do what is evil in the sight of the Lord? I'm having a war between my cat and dog, and if you hear lots of noise. In verse 20, but I did obey the Lord, Saul says. I went on the mission the Lord gave me. I brought back Agag, king of the Amalekites, and I completely destroyed the Amalekites. The troops took sheep and cattle for their plunder, the best of what was set apart for destruction, to sacrifice to the Lord at Gilgal. And Samuel ends up saying, look, to obey God is better than sacrifice. It ends up being that Saul ends up saying he was afraid of the people, so he obeyed them. He rather would listen to the people and please them than to obey God. And Samuel goes on to say, because you rejected the word of the Lord has rejected you from being king of Israel. And then Samuel went out and hacked Agag to pieces before the Lord at Gilgal. And then the Lord regretted that he made Saul king over Israel, because he knows this is going to be an awful outcome to his people. And so what does this have to do with Mordecai? We remember that there was a brief genealogy in chapter 2 for Mordecai, so we're going to go back and visit this. Now, not all scholars agree on this. They think that this genealogy could possibly be some people we don't know in Scripture, that was maybe like his father and his grandfather, but we have studied that not all genealogies are in order exactly. They're not full of every ancestor that you could probably always have. A lot of times they are mentioning the key people that everyone would know within a family line. And so we do have to look at who was the most famous, Kish and Shimei, which were listed in Mordecai's family line. Kish was Saul's father, proving that Mordecai was was from the royal clan of the tribe of Benjamin. Mordecai was from Saul's line. He was a Benjamite, and he would have been from the royal line from King Saul. And Shimei is a character that is also from this royal line that is found in 2 Samuel. So after Saul was demoted from king of Israel and David was put in place, David was a mighty king after God's heart, but he ends up having children, and one of them were going to raise up a coup against David. His name was Absalom, and David has to flee for his life. So while he's fleeing for his life and his mighty men are with him, they come across Shimei, who is a descendant of King Saul. And he ends up yelling and cursing and throwing stones at King David because he is bitter that David replaced King Saul. Now, this should have been immediate put to death because of his behavior, but David had found grace on him and told his mighty men to back off, and he spared his life. Now, this is providence, because Shimei's life was spared, eventually comes Mordecai, who God is going to use to save the Jews. And so we see that the Benjamites and the Amalekites were at odds for a long time together. There was a lot of animosity, and it looks like Haman is a direct descendant of King Agag, and Mordecai is a direct descendant from King Saul. And so there's this these decades and maybe even a century of hatred between the two people groups. And so the Amalekites are going to go on harassing Israel for hundreds of years, burning villages, taking children, taking wives captive. So Mordecai does not bow when this new Haman comes in with this new position. Mordecai will not bow. Now, I read a lot of different opinions why Mordecai would not bow. A lot of people would praise Mordecai, saying, oh, it was his convictions. Jews were not supposed to bow to anyone else. But what I read from a group of scholars that all study the culture in the Middle East all agreed that this was not the case. This is not why Mordecai was not bowing, because of his personal convictions, because we know that there's a lot of things already that were against God's law that he was allowing his cousin to do. And so it's more likely, and they said that bowing in this instant was not forbidden in Scripture. God did not want you to bow to another god, but the Persian king was not looked at as a god in their society. So they said this would have been much like a respect thing, a handshake in our today's society. It was just to honor and show respect. It was not a form of worship. So this would not have been illegal under the Hebrew law. But it is more likely that there was just this hatred and animosity because of these two people groups. And so he was just showing Haman, I'm not going to bow to you because you're an Amalekite. This puts a bad taste in Haman's mouth. And not only is he going to go after Mordecai, he decides to exterminate the entire group of people. And one of the scholars that I listened to, Tom Bradford, was talking about that this really is the spirit of Amalek. There's a demonic spirit behind this, always having these people want to annihilate the entire Jewish population. Hitler had the same spirit on him. I mean, it just doesn't make sense. There's nothing rational about the amount of people in this world that have wanted to annihilate this small group of people. It's amazing that the Hebrew people are this ancient culture that's still in existence, because a lot of these cultures that we're reading about today don't even exist. But the fact that the Hebrew people are still in existence is just evidence that God is who he says he is. But then when you look through the history, I started researching and finding that it wasn't just Hitler. There was case after case after case where people tried to completely annihilate the entire Jewish race, and it doesn't make any sense. There's no real reason, while everyone else just sits back and watches and allows it to happen. So Haman ends up going to the king and saying, hey, for 375, well, I will pay you 375 tons of silver, which scholars say that this is about half of the annual income of the Persian Empire. Constable said 2/3 of the empire. It was millions of dollars. And Haman says, if you allow us to exterminate this people group that's not obeying you. I find it interesting that the king never even says, who is this people group? He never inquires of it. A couple of things. People suspected that this amount of money would have intrigued him because it would make up for the loss of taxes. Like, if we're going to annihilate an entire group of people, the king is going to immediately think, well, that's a lot of tax dollars I'm going to miss out on. So a large amount was offered to entice him, saying this will make up for the taxes. Another thing is that Persia might have been in some financial problems because of the war with Greece that had been happening and the failure of the war with Greece. Either way, Haman promises this ridiculous amount of money, and he was probably going to get that from all the plunder. The plunder is when people go to war and annihilate a group of people, they would take all their possessions. And so the Jewish people were wealthy. The people that went into exile were nobles and very educated, smart people. They left the poorest people. They were allowed to stay in Israel. So the people that are living among, the Jewish people that are living in the exile, they are extremely wealthy people. So this crazy law is put into place. The king agrees to it, gives Haman his ring to seal it, and we are finally in chapter 3. And I find this so interesting because Haman gets these wise men to cast lots. This is a common practice. Even the Jews practice this, but they cast these lots, and they're doing this to get the perfect time to annihilate the Jews. And so finally they come up with a time that is going to be a year from now, which two things could happen. This could be like, oh great, we have a year to worry about this. But at the same time, I look at it as they had a year to pray and fast and seek God for his saving hand. And so this perfect time was set by the casting of the lots. And my Bible words it the 13th day of the first month. Your translations might have said April 17th, but April 17th doesn't give us a clear understanding. I like this translation, the 13th day of the month, because two things are happening here. 13 was the most unlucky number to the Persians and Babylonians, and I think this is just God's sense of humor. You know what? I'm going to allow this to be on the 13th day, your unlucky number, but it's also this day, the 13th month, the 13th day of the first month is the day before Passover. The Jewish people, just like they celebrate Purim, this is going to be a feast in remembrance. Passover had been celebrated for centuries. It's a celebration of God's deliverance. It's a reminder. He is reminding them, hey, I delivered y'all back in Egypt. I'm going to deliver you again in Persia. And so this is an amazing, almost like secret code to the Jews. And Proverbs 16:33 says, the lot is cast into the lap, but the Lord determines how they fall. And so the Jewish people know that God really has complete control over all this lot. This is not just a random thing that the universe told Haman to do. God was in control, and a message was sent, unlucky to the Persians and deliverance to the Jews. And then the day that the actual event was going to take place was the 13th of Adar, which is March 7th. But I think that's funny. Again, we see the unlucky number 13. So our chapter ends with saying the king and Haman sat down for a drink while the city of Shushan was in confusion. These people don't know what's going on. They're sitting back. They're wondering what's happening. But we are going to see God start to turn the tables in this story of deliverance. Go ahead and read chapter 4 for next week. I'll see you next Thursday, but tune in Tuesday with Katie Hunt. Have a great weekend and happy reading.